In dealing with conflict, let's look at the possible causes of conflict, or rather the possible sources. Where does it come from? I think change becomes a catalytical concern when it comes to conflict. When we look at change, change is no longer viewed as a variable, but rather it is now viewed as a constant, meaning that change is constantly revolving in our countries, in our nation, and from a world perspective. Change, or rather a change of anything, can be viewed as being stressful. Change is a catalyst for conflict. Human beings generally are creatures of habits. And so they seek to change these habits, and in particular, when conflict emerges. The next possible source could be an interpersonal or regarding interpersonal relationships. No one individual is exactly the same as another, meaning that we are unique beings in a global environment. We are individuals with varying diversities. Each has a set of different fingerprints, a different heartbeat from another, and we generally tend to view the world differently from the person sitting next to us. So putting it into perspective, putting 10 individuals in a particular team for the first time can cause conflict as they seek common ground in working together. Why? Because they are different. And being different and meeting somebody else who's different has the potential for conflict. And looking at the next point that could possibly cause conflict, we look at the relationship between a supervisor and employee. Personalities in a team may not always mesh, meaning there's conflict. Think about the relationship between an employee and his or her boss, more so when that relationship is a difficult one. The resultant becomes conflict. They may think differently, they may see things differently, and they may seek to address things differently. Our next point, when we look at the possible sources, is poor communication. When we look at poor communication, what is symptomatic of poor communication? It can be a lack of understanding of what communication is. Whilst a lot of people use communication, it doesn't necessarily mean that we fully understand and embrace effective communication. In communication, people need to know why we communicate. We also need to know and find the right medium of communication. Sometimes instead of talking one-on-one, we send an SMS, and it might not be the most appropriate medium of communication. Because sometimes when we talk about sensitive issues, we want to see the expressions of the other parties. We want to see the emotions that are shown in one-on-one communication. Poor communication could be a result of people not knowing when to communicate, meaning it might be the wrong timing to communicate. People also need to know where to communicate. Is the environment conducive to communicate effectively? And people need to know who they are communicating with. Communication is probably the most challenging skill for any individual, group, or company. And getting it right takes effort. Most conflict emerges within the confines of poor communication. Therefore, effective communication is an imperative for conflict resolution. Our next point that we'll look at is what we call subpar performance. And generally, when we look at this aspect, it can lead to rewarding underachievers and punishing performers within an organization. And it's something that the supervisor or leader may need to really look carefully at. And further along in our topic, we'll be able to unpack what's symptomatic to subperformance. But for now, let's just look at the supervisor or leader who sometimes fails to address such a situation can fuel tension, resulting in a conflict. Looking at the next possible source, we talk about harassment. Harassment, or harassment as other people would want to say, takes many forms, shapes, and sizes. It may have a context towards sexual harassment, racial, and gender, just to name a couple. And so we need to be able to buttress this or be able to stem the possibility of harassment where policies are encouraged to correct behavior outcomes that can help stem possible conflict. So harassment becomes a possible source of conflict. And looking at our next point, a lack of resources or limited resources can have an impact in possible sources of conflict. It may be a situation where an organization is scaling back or cutting back on resources. And this could also apply to families, communities, and companies. And this can emerge as a source of conflict. Why? Well, there tends to be competition within such groupings that are gunning for the limited resources, and this can easily evoke conflict. And then let's also look at the possibilities of perceptions and assumptions that are made in conflict as a possible source. Individuals tend to see life with differing lenses from one another. And so what we see and what our fellow person who's next to us sees may always never be the same. And so hence, there's the element of conflict. Therefore, they are likely to differ in perception and assumptions. Meaning we perceive things differently and we assume things differently, and yet we could be looking at the same picture. The root cause of such can be but not only limited to the following. It could be a difference in attitude, meaning that our attitude may be impacted by where we grew up, how we grew up. It could be a difference in values. It could be a difference in ethics. It could be a different because of our skill sets. Our priorities in life differ. Lack of teamwork could have an impact. And so it's imperative that we understand clarity of our roles and responsibilities, because it will have either a positive or negative perception and assumptions on how we see our environment. And so therefore, this is a possible source of conflict.